I never thought a simple name tag could break my heart into 1,000 pieces, but there I was, standing in my own backyard, the same backyard where I'd hosted countless barbecues, birthday parties, and holiday gatherings for over 40 years, staring at a white sticker that read, "The old lady, ignore her." My name is Margaret Thompson, and at 73, I've seen enough of life to know when I'm being dismissed. But this wasn't just anyone dismissing me. This was my own family. The reunion I'd been planning for months, sending handwritten invitations on cream-colored cardstock, coordinating schedules across 3 time zones, and preparing my famous apple pie recipe that 3 generations had grown up loving, had become my public humiliation. The summer heat in suburban Columbus, Ohio, felt suffocating as I watched my children and grandchildren laugh and chat in small groups across the perfectly manicured lawn. The smell of charcoal and grilling burgers mixed with the scent of my prize-winning roses, the David Austin varieties I'd carefully cultivated for 15 years, creating what should have been the perfect family atmosphere. The red checkered tablecloths I'd ironed that morning fluttered in the gentle breeze, and the string lights I'd hung between the oak trees cast a warm glow over the gathering. Instead of feeling proud of my hosting efforts, I felt like a ghost haunting my own celebration. I'd spent 3 weeks cleaning every corner of this 2-story colonial house, the same house where I'd raised 4 children as a single mother after their father left us when the youngest was barely walking. I'd scrubbed baseboards, polished silver, and even hired a carpet cleaning service to make sure everything was perfect. The same house where I'd worked double shifts at Murphy's Diner on Main Street to keep food on the table and still managed to help with homework every night, sitting at this very kitchen table under the yellow pendant light that had been there since 1987. The same house where I'd welcomed every new grandchild with hand-knitted blankets, every new boyfriend or girlfriend with my warmest smile, every celebration and every heartbreak with open arms and a listening ear. But apparently, none of that mattered anymore. I was just the old lady now, not Margaret, not Mom, not Grandma, just a dismissible elderly woman whose presence had become more obligation than joy. As I stood there, clutching that cruel name tag between my arthritic fingers, I couldn't help but wonder when exactly I'd become invisible to the people I'd given everything for. When had my voice stopped mattering in family discussions? When had my stories about their father, their grandfather, their family history become boring interruptions instead of cherished memories? When had my opinions on everything from politics to parenting become irrelevant simply because I'd accumulated too many birthdays? The worst part wasn't the tag itself, though the bold black letters seemed to mock me with every glance. It was the laughter that followed when my daughter-in-law, Sarah, handed it to me, as if my pain was just another family joke to be shared and forgotten. The way my own son Michael looked away, suddenly fascinated by the pattern on his paper plate, too embarrassed or too cowardly to defend the woman who'd sacrificed her youth to raise him. The way my grandchildren barely glanced up from their smartphones when I tried to join their conversations about college, careers, and relationships, topics I apparently had no business discussing, despite having lived through all of them. I felt something shift inside me that day, something that had been building for years, but finally crystallized in that moment of public humiliation. This wasn't just about a name tag. This was about respect, about recognition, about the value of a life lived in service to others. This was about decades of being taken for granted, of having my contributions minimized, of being treated like a piece of furniture that occasionally needed dusting. Little did they know, this old lady had more surprises left than they could ever imagine. And I was about to remind them exactly who Margaret Thompson really was. The moment that name tag touched my fingers, I felt my world tilt on its axis like a carnival ride gone wrong. Sarah's perfectly manicured hand, complete with French tips and a tennis bracelet that cost more than my monthly grocery budget, extended toward me with that white sticker, her smile bright and cruel as a winter morning. She announced to the entire gathering, her voice carrying across the yard with theatrical flair, "Here, Grandma Margaret, I made you a special name tag since some of the newer family members might not know who you are." The laughter that erupted from the group felt like physical blows raining down on my shoulders. My grandson Jake, now 22 and sporting a beard that made him look older than his years, actually snorted while scrolling through his phone. "That's hilarious, Mom. Grandma's always trying to tell us those old stories anyway. Like, we get it. Life was different back then. His dismissive tone cut deeper than any knife could have. I stood there in my best floral dress, the navy blue one with tiny pink roses that I'd bought specifically for this reunion at Macy's, spending more than I should have on something I'd probably only wear once, feeling the heat of embarrassment crawl up my neck like poison ivy. The Ohio sun beat down mercilessly on my silver hair, but it was nothing compared to the burning shame spreading through my chest like wildfire. Around me, the sounds of family celebration continued. Children splashing in the above-ground pool I'd saved for 6 months to install, their squeals of delight echoing off the wooden fence. Adults enjoying the elaborate spread I'd prepared since 4 a.m, including homemade potato salad, deviled eggs, and 3 different casseroles, everyone having a wonderful time at my expense. "Oh, come on, it's just a joke," Michael said when he saw my face, but he couldn't meet my eyes. His voice carried that same dismissive tone he'd used as a teenager when caught doing something wrong. My own son, the boy I'd rocked to sleep every night after his father abandoned us for his secretary, the child I'd taught to ride a bike in this very yard, couldn't even look at me while his wife humiliated me in front of our entire extended family. He'd grown soft around the middle, his hair thinning at the crown, but in that moment, he looked exactly like the coward his father had been. I watched as my other children, Patricia with her designer sunglasses and constant phone checking, David nervously adjusting his golf shirt, and Jennifer pretending to be busy organizing the dessert table, exchanged uncomfortable glances but said nothing. 47 years of sacrifice, of putting their needs before mine, of being their rock through divorces, job losses, teenage pregnancies, and every crisis life threw at them, and not one of them had the courage to speak up for me. Not one of them remembered the nights I'd stayed up helping with science projects, the mornings I'd driven them to school in a car held together with prayer and duct tape, the countless times I'd chosen their happiness over my own comfort. The younger generation was even worse. My grandchildren, ranging from 8-year-old Emma with her gap-toothed grin to 25-year-old Marcus with his MBA and expensive watch, barely acknowledged my presence except to ask where the bathroom was, if there was more soda, or whether the Wi-Fi password had changed. These were the same children I'd babysat countless times, often for entire weekends when their parents needed couple time. The ones I'd taught to ride bikes on this same driveway, helped with homework at my kitchen table, and spoiled with homemade chocolate chip cookies and elaborate bedtime stories featuring dragons and princesses and brave knights who always did the right thing. As I peeled off that degrading name tag, my hands trembling with a mixture of hurt and rage that threatened to consume me whole, I made a decision that would change everything. The adhesive left a small residue on my dress, a tiny reminder of this moment that I knew would stay with me forever. I wasn't going to let this slide. I wasn't going to smile and pretend it was funny. I wasn't going to be the family doormat anymore, the convenient grandmother who showed up when needed and disappeared when inconvenient. I walked into my house, past the family photos lining the hallway, pictures of graduations I'd attended despite working double shifts, weddings I'd helped plan and partially funded, babies I'd helped deliver and then cared for during those exhausting first weeks. And I felt something I hadn't felt in years, determination mixed with righteous anger. They thought I was just the old lady they could ignore. They were about to learn exactly who Margaret Thompson really was, and more importantly, what their lives would look like without her quiet, constant support. What would you do in my place? Would you let your own family treat you like you were invisible, like your decades of sacrifice meant nothing? Or would you find a way to remind them of your worth? Hit that subscribe button and let me know in the comments, because this story is just getting started. And trust me, you won't want to miss what happens next when this old lady decides to fight back. The rest of that reunion passed in a blur of forced smiles and swallowed pride, each moment feeling like an eternity of emotional torture. I served my famous apple pie, the recipe my own grandmother had passed down to me, along with her worn wooden rolling pin and the secret of adding just a touch of cardamom, and watched as everyone devoured it without a single thank you. Slice after slice disappeared from the glass pie plates I'd inherited from my mother, the same plates that had served birthday cakes and holiday desserts for 3 generations of our family. I cleaned up spilled drinks from the picnic tables, my arthritic knees protesting as I bent to retrieve dropped napkins and paper plates. I wiped down surfaces sticky with barbecue sauce and lemonade, picked up trash that had been carelessly dropped on my carefully maintained lawn, and refilled serving bowls, while my family continued their conversations as if I were part of the furniture, useful when needed, invisible when not. The conversation swirled around me like water around a stone. Patricia discussed her latest promotion at the marketing firm, her voice animated as she described her corner office and company car. David bragged about his restaurant's recent review in the local paper, conveniently forgetting to mention that I'd been the one to suggest the signature dish that earned the praise. Jennifer showed off photos from her recent vacation to Europe, a trip funded by money I'd quietly transferred to her account when she'd mentioned wanting to find herself after her divorce. That night, after the last car had pulled out of my driveway, Michael's SUV with its bumper sticker reading, "World's Greatest Dad," a title he'd never have earned without my help, and the last goodbye had been called out without anyone bothering to help me clean up, I sat alone in my kitchen surrounded by dirty dishes and leftover food. The silence was deafening after hours of laughter and chatter that had somehow managed to exclude me completely. The grandfather clock in the hallway, a wedding gift from 48 years ago, chimed midnight as I finally finished loading the dishwasher. I kept replaying the moment with that name tag, feeling the sting fresh each time like picking at a scab. But more than the humiliation, I felt something else growing inside me, a quiet anger that had been simmering for years, like a pot left too long on the stove. When had I become so invisible? When had my contributions to this family become so meaningless that they could be dismissed with a cruel joke? I thought about my late husband, Robert, who'd passed away 15 years ago after a brief but brutal battle with cancer. He used to tell me I was the glue that held our family together, the one who remembered every birthday, every anniversary, every important moment in each of their lives. "Without you, Maggie," he'd say, while we sat on the front porch swing he'd built with his own hands, "this family would fall apart like a house of cards in a windstorm." But apparently, that glue had lost its stickiness somewhere along the way, or maybe they'd just stopped noticing it was there. The next few days were the hardest I'd experienced since Robert's funeral. I kept expecting phone calls, maybe someone thanking me for hosting, or at least checking to see if I was okay after Sarah's cruel joke. But my phone remained silent, except for telemarketers and automated reminders about prescription refills. It was as if the reunion had never happened, as if I had never mattered at all to the people I'd spent my entire adult life nurturing and supporting. I found myself going through the motions of my daily routine like a woman sleepwalking through her own life. My morning coffee, usually a cherished ritual enjoyed while reading the newspaper on my sun-drenched breakfast nook, tasted bitter and cold. My afternoon soap operas, a guilty pleasure I'd indulged in for 20 years, couldn't hold my attention as my mind wandered to that humiliating name tag. Even my beloved garden, usually my sanctuary where I could lose myself in the meditative work of weeding and watering, felt like a chore that reminded me of all the family gatherings I'd hosted among those carefully tended flower beds. But then something shifted on the fourth day after the reunion. I was dusting the living room, mechanically moving my cloth across surfaces I'd cleaned 1,000 times before, when I knocked over a small wooden box that had been sitting on my bookshelf for years. It was a jewelry box Robert had made for me in his workshop, carved with intricate roses that matched the ones in my garden. As it hit the hardwood floor with a hollow thud, dozens of old letters scattered across the carpet like fallen leaves. Letters I'd written but never sent. Letters I'd received and saved. Documents and photographs that told the real story of our family's history. As I knelt to gather them up, my reading glasses sliding down my nose, one particular envelope caught my eye. It was addressed to my children in my own careful handwriting from 20 years ago, but the seal had never been broken. The return address was from St. Mary's Hospital, where I'd spent 3 weeks recovering from pneumonia that had nearly killed me, alone, because I'd told everyone I was fine and didn't need visitors, not wanting to burden them with my problems. I opened it with shaking hands and began to read my own words from 2 decades past, words I'd written in that sterile hospital room while machines beeped around me and nurses checked my vitals every few hours. What I found there made me realize that my family didn't just not know who I was now. They'd never known who I really was at all. And suddenly, I knew exactly what I needed to do. They wanted to ignore the old lady? Fine. But first, they were going to learn exactly what this old lady had done for them, and what she was still capable of doing. The real Margaret Thompson was about to make her debut, and it was going to be a performance they'd never forget. The letter I'd found was just the beginning of what would become the most important archaeological dig of my life. Over the next week, I became an explorer of my own history, digging through boxes in the dusty attic where summer heat made the air thick as soup, drawers I hadn't opened in years that stuck from humidity and neglect, and photo albums thick with dust that made me sneeze as I turned each page. What I discovered was a treasure trove of family history that my children and grandchildren had never seen, and more importantly, had never bothered to ask about. The attic yielded boxes labeled in my careful handwriting: Michael's school years, Patricia's dance recitals, David's baseball trophies, Jennifer's art projects. Inside each box were not just mementos of their childhoods, but evidence of my involvement in every aspect of their lives. Report cards I'd helped them achieve through hours of patient tutoring at the kitchen table, programs from school plays where I'd sewn costumes late into the night, my fingers pricked by needles and eyes strained from working under the sewing room lamp, certificates from activities I'd driven them to in our old station wagon, sometimes making 3 trips in one afternoon to accommodate everyone's schedules. There were letters I'd written to each of my children during their difficult teenage years, filled with encouragement and wisdom I'd never had the courage to share face to face. Letters to Michael when he was struggling with math in high school, telling him I believed in his intelligence even when his grades didn't reflect it. Letters to Patricia when she was dealing with bullies, reminding her of her worth and strength. Letters to David when he was questioning his dreams of opening a restaurant, encouraging him to pursue his passion despite the risks. Letters to Jennifer when she was going through her rebellious phase, expressing my unconditional love even when her behavior broke my heart. There were photographs from my time as a volunteer at the Riverside Women's Shelter, where I'd spent every Saturday morning for 12 years helping families get back on their feet. Pictures of me serving meals, organizing clothing drives, and teaching job interview skills to women who'd lost everything. I'd never mentioned this work to my family, partly from modesty, and partly because I knew they'd worry about my safety in what they considered a rough part of town. There were certificates from the community college courses I'd taken in my 50s, earning a degree in social work that I'd never mentioned because I didn't want to seem like I was bragging or trying to compete with my children's achievements. Night classes I'd attended after working all day, studying by lamplight after everyone else was asleep, determined to better myself, even though no one expected it of a middle-aged widow. But the most shocking discovery was a manila folder labeled Family Financial Records that contained documents spanning 30 years, meticulously organized in chronological order. Inside were bank statements, loan papers, and receipts that told a story my family had never known, a story of quiet sacrifice that would have humbled them if they'd bothered to ask. Every time one of my children had faced a financial crisis, Michael's mortgage when he was laid off from the auto plant, Patricia's medical bills after her car accident, David's business loan when his restaurant was failing and the bank wouldn't extend his credit, Jennifer's college tuition when her scholarship fell through. I had been there, quietly transferring money from my modest savings account. The numbers were staggering when I added them up on my old calculator, the one with the faded numbers that I'd used to balance our family budget for 20 years. Over the decades, I'd given away nearly everything I'd saved, living on Social Security and my small pension from the diner so my children could have better lives. I'd eaten generic cereal and store-brand soup so Michael could keep his house. I'd worn the same winter coat for 8 years so Patricia could afford her medical treatments. I'd postponed my own dental work so David could buy restaurant equipment. I'd canceled my cable television and clipped coupons religiously so Jennifer could graduate without student loans. I'd never told them. I'd never asked for recognition or repayment. I'd simply done what mothers do. I'd sacrificed my own security to ensure theirs, believing that their happiness was worth more than my comfort. The irony wasn't lost on me as I sat surrounded by evidence of my generosity. The woman they'd labeled as ignorable had been the invisible foundation holding up their entire financial stability for decades. Without my quiet support, Michael would have lost his house, Patricia would have declared bankruptcy, David's restaurant would have failed, and Jennifer would have dropped out of college. But the discovery that truly broke my heart was a stack of birthday cards I'd bought but never sent, stored in a shoebox that smelled of lavender sachets. Each year, I'd carefully selected cards for my grandchildren, spending time in the Hallmark store reading every option until I found the perfect message, I'd written long, heartfelt notes about how proud I was of them, how much I loved them, how I saw their potential even when they couldn't see it themselves. Messages about Jake's artistic talent, Emma's kindness to animals, Marcus's leadership abilities, and all the other grandchildren's unique gifts. But each year, I'd chickened out, afraid they'd think I was being too sentimental, too clingy, too much like just an old lady who didn't understand their modern lives. So the cards had remained unsent, my love unexpressed, my pride in them hidden away like a shameful secret. As I sat in my living room that evening, surrounded by the evidence of a life lived in service to others, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: pride. Not the boastful kind that demands recognition, but the quiet satisfaction of knowing I'd made a difference. Even if no one had noticed, I'd been the silent guardian angel of my family, the invisible safety net that caught them when they fell. The summer heat had given way to the crisp coolness of early September, and the changing leaves outside my window seemed to mirror the transformation happening inside me. The maple tree Robert had planted the year Michael was born was turning brilliant shades of red and gold, a reminder that even in endings, there could be beauty. I was done being invisible. I was done apologizing for taking up space. I was done letting my family treat me like I was disposable. I was done hiding my light under a bushel, as my grandmother used to say. I picked up my phone and started making calls, not to my children. They'd had their chance to reach out after the reunion, and their silence spoke volumes. Instead, I called my grandson Tommy, the quiet one who'd always been different from the rest, the one who still sent me handwritten thank you notes and called me just to chat about his classes and his dreams. "Tommy," I said when he answered on the third ring, his voice warm and genuinely pleased to hear from me. "I need your help with something important. Can you come over this weekend? I have some family history I think you'd find very interesting." What I didn't tell him was that I was about to turn our family's understanding of itself upside down. The old lady they'd chosen to ignore was about to remind them exactly who she was, and more importantly, who they'd be without her. This reunion was far from over. In fact, the real reunion, the one where truth would finally be told, was just beginning. Tommy arrived that Saturday morning with the same gentle smile he'd had since he was a little boy, the one that reminded me so much of his grandfather Robert. At 19, he was the middle child of my youngest daughter Jennifer, caught between his older sister's academic achievements at Northwestern University and his younger brother's athletic prowess on the high school football team. He'd always been the quiet observer, the one who noticed things others missed, the one who still hugged me without embarrassment at family gatherings and asked genuine questions about my life. He stood in my doorway, wearing a faded Ohio State t-shirt and jeans with holes in the knees, not the fashionable kind, but the honest wear that came from a young man who worked part-time at a local bookstore to help pay for community college. His dark hair, inherited from his father's side, was tousled from the September wind, and his brown eyes, my eyes, passed down through generations, held the same curiosity that had made him my favorite grandchild, though I'd never admit that aloud. "What's all this, Grandma?" he asked, looking at the boxes and folders I'd arranged on my dining room table like evidence in a courtroom. The afternoon sunlight streaming through my lace curtains illuminated the documents, photographs, and letters that represented decades of hidden family history. "This," I said, pouring him a glass of fresh lemonade in one of my good crystal glasses, the ones I usually saved for special occasions, "is our family's real story, the one nobody bothers to tell anymore. The one that's been gathering dust while everyone's been too busy with their own lives to ask about the past." I started with the photographs, each one carefully removed from protective sleeves I'd used to preserve them over the years. Pictures of me as a young mother, working 2 jobs while pregnant with my 4th child, my belly round under a waitress uniform that had seen better days. Images of me at my high school graduation. Yes, I'd gone back to school at 45, something none of my children even remembered because they'd been too caught up in their own teenage dramas to pay attention to their mother's achievements. "You went back to high school?" Tommy asked, his voice filled with genuine amazement as he studied a photograph of me in cap and gown, standing proudly next to my guidance counselor. "High school and then community college," I said, unable to keep the pride completely out of my voice. "I wanted to show you kids that it's never too late to learn, never too late to better yourself. I studied at night after you were all asleep, did homework at the kitchen table by lamplight, took tests on Saturday mornings while your parents slept in. There were photos of me volunteering at the food bank every Thanksgiving for 15 years, organizing charity drives that collected thousands of dollars for local families in need, teaching Sunday school for 20 years to children whose parents were too busy to attend church themselves. Pictures of me at city council meetings, speaking up for causes I believed in, the library renovation, the senior center expansion, the crosswalk installation near the elementary school after a child was nearly hit by a car. Tommy's eyes widened as I showed him newspaper clippings I'd saved in a scrapbook with a faded blue cover. "Grandma, you were in the paper?" "Several times," I said, trying to keep the pride out of my voice but failing. "This one's from when I organized the fundraiser for the Johnson family after their house burned down. We raised $8,000 in 2 weeks. This one's from when I started the community garden program that's still running today, teaching families how to grow their own vegetables. And this one," I paused, holding up a yellowed article with a photograph of me speaking at a podium. "This one's from when I testified at the city council meeting to save the old Carnegie Library from demolition." "You saved the library?" Tommy's voice was filled with awe. "That's where I go to study when it's too noisy at home. I had no idea you were the reason it's still there." But it was the financial records that really got his attention, that made him understand the true scope of what I'd been hiding. As I explained how I'd quietly supported each of my children through their crises, Tommy's expression shifted from curiosity to something approaching reverence. I showed him bank statements, transfer receipts, loan documents, all the paper trail of a mother's love expressed in dollars and cents. "Mom never told me you helped with my college fund," he said softly, his voice thick with emotion as he studied a bank statement showing a transfer of $5,000, my entire savings at the time, to Jennifer's account. "I asked her not to. I didn't want you kids to feel obligated to me, didn't want you to think you owed me anything for doing what any grandmother would do." I laughed, but there was no humor in it, only the bitter irony of good intentions gone wrong. Turns out, I shouldn't have worried about that. The afternoon flew by as I shared story after story, document after document. Tommy listened with the kind of attention I hadn't received from a family member in years, asking thoughtful questions, making connections between past events and present circumstances, gradually beginning to understand the scope of what I'd been hiding and why. I showed him the unsent birthday cards, watching his face crumple as he read the loving messages I'd written but never delivered. I shared the letters I'd written during my hospital stay, letters filled with wisdom and love that my children had never seen. I explained about the women's shelter, the community college degree, the countless ways I'd contributed to our community while my own family remained oblivious. "Grandma," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper, "why didn't you ever tell us any of this? Why did you keep it all secret?" I was quiet for a long moment, looking out at my garden where the late afternoon sun was casting long shadows across the lawn where that humiliating reunion had taken place just weeks ago. The roses were still blooming, defiant against the approaching autumn, their petals scattered on the ground like confetti from a celebration no one had attended. Because I was raised to believe that good deeds should be done quietly, that mothers shouldn't brag about their sacrifices, that love should be given freely without expectation of recognition or reward. I paused, feeling the weight of decades of silence, because I thought that if I was just good enough, generous enough, selfless enough, my family would naturally appreciate me. I thought love and respect would come automatically, that I didn't need to ask for them. "But that's not fair," Tommy said, his voice thick with emotion and righteous anger on my behalf. "You've done so much for all of us, and we just take it for granted. We treat you like you're invisible." "Yes," I said simply, the word hanging in the air between us like a confession. "You do." That evening, as Tommy helped me organize the documents back into their boxes, handling each piece of paper like a precious artifact, he asked the question I'd been hoping he would ask. "What are you going to do with all this? You can't just keep it hidden forever?" I smiled, feeling more energized than I had in months, more purposeful than I'd felt since Robert died. "I'm going to make sure our family knows who Margaret Thompson really is. And I'm going to start with your mother's birthday party next month. It's time for some truth-telling." Tommy grinned, and for a moment he looked exactly like the little boy who used to help me bake cookies and listen to my stories with rapt attention. "Need any help?" "Actually," I said, "I think I do. But first, I need you to promise me something. This stays between us until I'm ready to reveal everything. Can you do that? He nodded solemnly, understanding the gravity of what I was asking. Whatever you need, Grandma. It's about time someone stood up for you. It's about time our family knew the truth. As I watched him drive away that evening in his beat-up Honda Civic, I felt something I hadn't experienced since that awful reunion: hope mixed with determination. The old lady they'd chosen to ignore was about to remind them that she'd been the author of their family story all along, the invisible hand that had guided their lives and made their successes possible. And the next chapter was going to be very different from what they expected. Very different indeed. Jennifer's 50th birthday party was scheduled for the first Saturday in October, and I had exactly 3 weeks to orchestrate what would become the most important family gathering in decades. Unlike the cruel surprise of that reunion name tag, this time, I would be the one controlling the narrative. I called Jennifer on Monday morning, offering to host her birthday celebration. I know Sarah usually organizes these things, but I'd love to do something special for your milestone birthday. Something intimate, just family, in my backyard where you used to play as a child. The next 2 weeks were a whirlwind of preparation. I planned a menu showcasing all my signature dishes, but the real preparation was happening in my spare bedroom. Tommy came over every evening, helping me organize photographs chronologically and create what he called a multimedia presentation, using his laptop and a projector borrowed from college. "Are you sure you want to do this, Grandma?" Tommy asked one evening. "Once you tell them all this, you can't take it back." I looked at him over my reading glasses. "Tommy, I've spent 73 years putting other people's comfort before my own truth. It's time for them to see who I really am." The morning of Jennifer's party dawned crisp and clear. The family began arriving at 2 o'clock, gathering in the same spots they'd occupied during that humiliating reunion. But this time, I had an agenda, and Tommy was positioned near the projector we'd hidden behind a potted plant. "Thank you all for coming to celebrate Jennifer's milestone birthday," I began, my voice carrying across the yard with surprising strength. "Before we eat, I'd like to share some family history that I think you'll find interesting, some stories that have never been told." I gestured to Tommy, who clicked the first slide. A photograph appeared, me in a hospital bed, holding newborn Jennifer, exhausted but radiant. 50 years ago, when Jennifer was born, I was a 33-year-old widow with 3 other children and a mountain of debt. I worked 2 jobs to support this family, but what you never knew was that I also went back to school. Click. Another slide. Me in cap and gown, diploma in hand. The yard had gone completely quiet. I earned my high school diploma at 45 and then got a degree in social work. I graduated summa cum laude. Click. The next slide showed newspaper clippings, certificates, awards, evidence of a life lived in service to the community. While you were all growing up, I was volunteering at the women's shelter, organizing charity drives, serving on the library board. I testified at city council meetings and started the community garden that still feeds dozens of families. But the real shock came with the financial records. Now, let me tell you about the money. Click. Bank statements filled the screen. Transfer after transfer laid bare. Michael, when you were laid off in 2008 and facing foreclosure, the $15,000 came from my retirement savings. Patricia, your medical bills after the car accident, the $8,000 came from me. David, your restaurant loan when the bank turned you down, I mortgaged this house. Jennifer, your college tuition, graduate school, apartment down payment, all from a woman you labeled as the old lady you could ignore. The silence was deafening. Tommy clicked to the final slide, a photograph of all of us from Jennifer's graduation. Everyone celebrating while I stood apart, the invisible foundation. I never asked for recognition or repayment because I thought that's what love meant, giving without expectation. But apparently, when you give without asking for anything in return, people assume your contributions have no value. The tears started then, spreading across the yard like a wave. Jennifer was openly sobbing. Michael had his head in his hands. Even Sarah was wiping her eyes. So here's what's going to happen. I'm done being invisible. I'm done being taken for granted. I'm done pretending that your neglect doesn't hurt. Jennifer stood up and walked toward me with uncertain steps. Mom, I'm so sorry. We had no idea. But I held up my hand. The question isn't whether you're sorry. The question is what you're going to do differently now that you know the truth. What would you do in my place? Would you forgive a family that had taken you for granted for decades, or would you demand the respect you'd always deserved? Let me know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe, because this confrontation is far from over. The aftermath of my revelation was unlike anything I'd experienced in 73 years. Jennifer's birthday party had transformed from a celebration into a reckoning, and I watched as decades of assumptions crumbled like a house of cards. Jennifer stumbled toward me, tears streaming down her face. "Mom, I don't know what to say. Why didn't you ever tell us?" Michael stood up abruptly, his face red with emotion. "Jesus Christ, Mom! All these years, we thought you were just a regular mom who didn't understand our lives. I had no idea you'd mortgage the house for David's restaurant." David, silent throughout my presentation, finally spoke. "The loan officer mentioned additional collateral, but I never asked what that meant." "You assumed what?" Patricia demanded, her composure shattered. "You assumed money just appeared out of thin air?" The grandchildren began to understand that something fundamental had shifted. Jake, who'd dismissed my stories as boring, stared at the screen. "Grandma, when Mom said we had money for my college education, that was you?" I nodded, watching truth ripple through the younger generation. Emma, my youngest granddaughter, walked over and slipped her hand into mine. "Are you sad, Grandma?" she asked with 8-year-old wisdom. "I was sad, sweetheart, but I'm not anymore. Sometimes we have to tell the truth even when it's hard." Sarah finally found her voice. "Margaret, I owe you an apology. That name tag was cruel and thoughtless." "The problem isn't what you didn't know, Sarah. The problem is that you never bothered to ask. None of you did." Tommy stepped forward. "Grandma's been the invisible foundation of this family for decades. While you were living your lives, she was making those lives possible. And instead of thanking her, you made jokes about her being the old lady you could ignore." As evening approached, conversations became more personal and honest than any we'd had in years. My children shared memories they'd forgotten, times they'd dismissed my opinions or ignored my contributions. Marcus, my oldest grandson, asked the crucial question, "Grandma, what do you want from us now? How do we make this right?" I looked around at my family and saw not the dismissive people who'd humiliated me, but the children and grandchildren I'd raised and loved. I want to be seen. I want my opinions to matter. I want my stories to be heard instead of dismissed. I want to be included in your lives as more than just the woman who hosts holidays. I want to be treated like a person whose thoughts and feelings have value. As the evening ended, each family member hugged me, really hugged me. They made promises about calling more often, visiting regularly, including me meaningfully in their lives. Whether they'd keep those promises remained to be seen, but for the first time in years, I felt hopeful. The week following Jennifer's party was unlike any since Robert's death. My phone rang constantly. Each of my children called multiple times, their voices carrying shame, gratitude, and desperate need to make amends. Michael visited Tuesday morning with flowers and nervous energy. He sat at my kitchen table, trying to find words for feelings he'd never articulated. "Mom, I keep thinking about that name tag, how I let Sarah humiliate you. I've been thinking about Dad leaving us, and how you never made us feel like burdens." He paused. "I want to pay you back, the mortgage money, everything." "Michael, that's not what this is about." "Then what is it about?" "It's about seeing me. It's about remembering I'm not just your mother. I'm a person with my own thoughts, dreams, and feelings. It's about including me because you want to, not because you feel obligated." Similar conversations played out with each child. Patricia came with photo albums, wanting to hear stories she'd previously dismissed. David proposed featuring my pot roast recipe on his restaurant menu. Jennifer helped me set up social media accounts to share my volunteer work. But the conversation with Sarah truly tested my capacity for forgiveness. She arrived Saturday afternoon, alone, her confidence replaced by genuine humility. "Margaret, I don't know how to apologize for that name tag. I thought I was being funny, but I was being cruel. Why did you think it was acceptable to humiliate me?" Sarah was quiet, then admitted, "Because I was jealous of how much Michael loves you, respects your opinion. I wanted to diminish that so I could feel more important." She continued, "I grew up where love was conditional, where you had to earn affection. When I saw how unconditionally you loved your children, it threatened everything I thought I knew about family. I felt understanding, not quite forgiveness, but comprehension. Sarah, there's enough love in this family for everyone. My relationship with Michael doesn't diminish yours with him. The most powerful moment came Sunday evening when all my grandchildren arrived together, not sent by parents, but organizing the visit themselves. "Grandma," Jake said, "we want to hear your stories. All of them." Emma climbed into my lap. "Tell us about when you saved the library." For the first time in years, I had an audience that genuinely wanted to hear what I had to say. I told them about growing up, meeting their grandfather, the struggles of single motherhood, going back to school, volunteer work that gave my life meaning. They listened with attention I'd forgotten was possible, asking questions, making connections. When Marcus found the old newspaper article online about my library testimony, he read it aloud with pride. "You're kind of famous, Grandma, and we never knew." As they prepared to leave, Jake lingered. "Grandma, I'm sorry about calling your stories boring. I was being a jerk." "You weren't being a jerk, sweetheart. You were being 19. But now you're growing up, and part of that is learning to see people as more than just the roles they play in your life. What would you do in my place? Would you be able to forgive family members who'd taken you for granted? Or would the hurt run too deep? Let me know in the comments, and make sure you're subscribed, because the final chapter will show how one woman's courage can transform an entire family's understanding of love and respect. 6 months have passed since that transformative October evening. As I sit in my garden this spring morning, watching roses bloom in brilliant profusion, I can hardly believe how much has changed, not just in my family's treatment of me, but in my own understanding of what I deserve. The changes didn't happen overnight. There were setbacks, moments when old patterns tried to reassert themselves, but gradually, the dynamics that had defined our family for decades began to shift. Michael set up weekly coffee dates, not because he needed something, but because he wanted to spend time with his mother. We meet every Tuesday, and he asks about my volunteer work, my garden, my opinions on everything from politics to family decisions. Sarah's transformation has been remarkable. The woman who humiliated me has become one of my strongest advocates, consulting with me on every family gathering detail, treating me as co-host rather than guest. Patricia interviewed me for a work presentation about women who'd made community contributions without recognition. The presentation was so well received, she's been invited to speak at conferences about invisible community leaders. David added my pot roast recipe to his restaurant menu and hired me as a consultant for Comfort Food Classics. I spend one afternoon weekly in his kitchen, teaching staff techniques I've perfected over decades. Jennifer calls every Sunday evening for real conversations about our lives, thoughts, experiences. She started bringing children over individually for grandma dates, special one-on-one time. The transformation in my grandchildren fills me with hope. Jake now calls regularly asking about family history for a genealogy project. Marcus became my technology consultant, helping me set up a blog about volunteer work. Emma appointed herself my official biographer, coming over Saturdays with notebooks and endless questions. The most significant change has been in my own sense of self-worth. For decades, I'd defined myself through relationships to others. While those roles remain important, I've rediscovered Margaret Thompson, the individual, community volunteer, lifelong learner, library saver, garden starter. I've joined the city's Historical Preservation Committee and started teaching Your Story Matters at the Senior Center, helping other older adults document their experiences. Last month, I received a Community Service Award from the City Council. Standing at the podium where I'd once testified to save the library, looking at an audience including my entire family in the front row, I felt complete, finally being seen for who I truly was. As I finish this story, I realize it's not really an ending. It's a beginning. At 73, I'm more engaged with life, more confident in my worth, more excited about the future than I've been in decades. The woman who once stood humiliated by a cruel name tag has discovered she was never ignorable. She had simply allowed others to ignore her. The difference between those two things is everything. My family now knows who Margaret Thompson really is. Not just the old lady who can be dismissed, but a woman of substance whose voice deserves to be heard, whose contributions deserve recognition, whose love should never be taken for granted. I am Margaret Thompson, mother, grandmother, community volunteer, lifelong learner, library saver, garden starter, family foundation, and so much more. I am a woman whose story matters, whose experiences have value, whose presence has made a difference. I am not ignorable. I never was. The end.